The first thing to come back was the sound. Not the gentle hum of a world waking up, but the sterile, rhythmic beep of a machine I knew was keeping me alive. It was a metronome, counting out the seconds of my new, diminished existence. The second thing was a voice, tight, with a stress I recognized instantly. A voice that belonged to my firstborn, my son, Michael. "We have to liquidate quickly," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper just beyond the door. "The market's volatile. The lake house is the only thing that can cover this. It's our only way out." My lake house. The words floated through the thick fog in my mind, sharp and cold as ice shards. I tried to open my eyes, to call out his name, to tell him he was wrong, but my body was a leaden shell, a sarcophagus of flesh and bone. My eyelids were bolted shut. My tongue was a useless lump of clay in my mouth. Panic, cold, and absolute began to crawl up my throat, a silent scream that had nowhere to go. I was a prisoner in my own skull, the warden and the sole inmate of a cell I couldn't escape. Then came my daughter's voice, Rebecca's. Brittle, pragmatic, the voice of a businesswoman assessing an asset. "And the jewelry, Michael. Don't forget the jewelry. I need that capital to save the company. It's what she would want. Mom would understand." Would I? Would I understand that my children, my flesh and blood, were standing just outside my hospital room door, carving up my life like a Thanksgiving turkey before the body was even cold? The steady, insistent beeping of the heart monitor next to me seemed to mock the frantic, silent hammering in my chest. They thought I was gone, a vegetable, a collection of assets waiting to be dispersed, a final balance sheet to be tallied. The shock was so profound, it was almost clarifying. It burned away the fog of my post-stroke consciousness, leaving behind a terrible, lucid landscape. I could hear the squeak of their expensive shoes on the polished linoleum, the rustle of papers I couldn't see, appraisals perhaps, or listings. They weren't grieving. They were strategizing. This wasn't a vigil. It was a business meeting. "How's her condition?" That was Thomas, my youngest. His voice was weaker, colored with a tinge of something I once would have mistaken for concern. Now it just sounded like impatience. "No change," Michael said, dismissively, the words clipped and final. "The doctors say it's a massive stroke. We have to be realistic. It's about managing her affairs now." Affairs! The word was so clinical, so detached, as if I were a failed corporation to be dismantled. My life's work, the home my husband Richard and I had built with our own hands and hearts, the memories soaked into its very walls, all reduced to affairs? The thought was a physical pain, a fresh wound on top of the neurological devastation. A memory pierced through the panic so vivid, it was almost a hallucination. It was Richard standing on the wide, welcoming porch of the lake house 10 years ago. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Michael, then a cocksure young man, fresh with his finance degree, had just asked for a substantial loan for a guaranteed, high-risk investment. He'd used words like leverage and aggressive growth. Richard had listened patiently, his hands in the pockets of his old khakis, his gaze fixed on the calm blue water of the lake. "No, son," he'd said finally, his voice gentle but as firm as the granite bedrock beneath our feet. "I'll give you the money for a down payment on a house. I'll help you set up a college fund for your future kids. I'll even co-sign on this sensible business loan. But I won't give you money to patch holes in your character. And that's what this is. A shortcut." Michael had been furious, his face flushing with indignation. He had accused his father of not believing in him, of being too conservative, of not understanding the modern world of finance. But Richard had just shaken his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. "I believe in your potential, Michael. I don't believe in easy money. It's like salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you get. It rots a man from the inside out." Now, lying in this hospital bed, a silent witness to my own dismemberment, I understood the depth of Richard's wisdom. The rot had set in. It was deep. I could hear it in Michael's voice, not just greed, but a frantic, clawing desperation. He wasn't trying to get rich. He was trying to get whole. He was trying to plug a hole in his life with my assets. And my daughter? Rebecca had always been so driven, so determined to prove herself. When her first business, a small art gallery she poured her heart into, had failed spectacularly, Richard and I bailed her out. We wrote the check without a second thought, thinking we were showing our support, but perhaps we'd only given her money, not the validation she truly craved. Now she spoke of my jewelry, the simple string of pearls Richard gave me on our 25th anniversary, the antique emerald ring that was my own mother's, as commodities. They weren't memories to her. They were commodities. I wasn't just hearing their greed. I was hearing the echoes of their failures, their secrets, the parts of their lives they had so carefully hidden from me behind a facade of promotions and successful salary negotiations. They weren't monsters. They were my children, lost and flailing, and ready to sacrifice their own mother to stay afloat. And in that moment, the horror was joined by something else. A cold, hard resolve that settled deep in my bones. They thought this was the end of my story. They thought I was a silent spectator at my own demise. They had no idea I was about to become the director. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of beeps, hushed medical jargon, and the carefully cheerful voices of nurses who came and went like ghosts. My children visited daily, their performances of grief becoming more polished with each visit. Michael would hold my limp hand and talk about the stock market, his voice a low drone. Rebecca would arrange flowers in a vase while talking on her phone in hushed, urgent tones about shipping logistics and quarterly reports. They spoke at me, not to me. They saw a shell, a husk, and it suited their narrative perfectly. It absolved them of guilt. But someone else saw more. Her name was Sarah. She was a nurse in her late 30s with kind, tired eyes that clearly had seen more of life than she let on. She had a calm, steady presence that was a stark contrast to the frantic energy of my children. Unlike the others, she didn't fill the silence with meaningless chatter. She spoke to me as if I could understand every word. She'd describe the changing colors of the sky outside my window, tell me what was for lunch as if I had a choice, and adjust my pillows with the gentle efficiency that was a balm in my sterile, silent hell. One afternoon, Michael and Rebecca were in the room, their voices low but tense, sharp like broken glass. They were arguing about which realtor to use for the lake house. "We need someone aggressive," Michael insisted, his voice a low hiss. "Someone who can close in 30 days, no questions asked. We can't afford a long, drawn-out process." "And we need someone discreet," Rebecca countered. "The last thing I need is my business associates hearing about a fire sale. It affects my brand." I felt a surge of pure, helpless adrenaline, a desperate need to scream, "No! It's not for sale! It's my home!" And in that moment, I focused all my will, every ounce of my being, on my right eyelid. It was the tiniest of movements, a flicker, a spasming flutter that lasted less than a second, a desperate signal from a sinking ship. They didn't notice. They were too engrossed in their own selfish drama. But Sarah, who was checking my IV drip by the door, did. Her eyes met mine for a fleeting instant. I saw a flicker of surprise, then something else. Recognition. A spark of understanding. She said nothing. When my children left, their argument spilling out into the hallway, she came to my bedside. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the machines that were my constant companions. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She glanced at the closed door, then leaned closer. "My grandmother was in a home. My family, we got busy. Life gets in the way, you know. We thought she was gone, just a body in a bed. We visited, we brought her things, but we didn't really see her.
When she passed, we found a diary under her mattress. She'd been aware for the last 6 months of her life. She wrote about everything, about being lonely, about us. Sarah's voice broke, and she paused to compose herself, her jaw tight. "I will not let that happen to you," she said, her voice now steady and low, filled with a fierce conviction. "I will not let you be invisible." She leaned closer still, her warm hand covering my cold one. "If you can hear me, if you are in there, do something, anything. When I squeeze your hand, try to squeeze back." She took my hand in hers. It was warm, firm, a human anchor in a sea of indifference. I marshaled every neuron, every memory of strength I possessed. I thought of Richard. I thought of the lake house, of sunlight dappling through the pine trees. I thought of the audacity of my children. A command, white-hot and singular, shot from my brain down my arm, a desperate plea for connection. My fingers, limp and useless for days, contracted in a faint but unmistakable pressure against her palm. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them away, replaced by a fierce, protective look. "Okay, Eleanor," she said, a conspiratorial whisper. "Okay, we have work to do." She became my sentinel, my secret co-conspirator. During the day, in front of my family and other staff, she was the consummate professional. But when we were alone, she was my conduit to the world. She read my mail to me, angling the letters so I could see them with my one good eye. She held my phone, showing me the texts from my granddaughter, Olivia, filled with the typical angst of a 16-year-old, but also with a genuine, uncomplicated love that felt like a lifeline. One evening, she held up a letter from my lawyer, Harold. It was a standard follow-up note, expressing his sorrow over my condition and offering his services. Seeing his name, his familiar, stately letterhead, an idea began to form, a desperate, audacious plan. It was a long shot, a gamble on a provision Richard and I had put in place years ago, a complex legal structure designed as a contingency for a disaster we never truly thought would come. We called it the Legacy Project. It was our ultimate failsafe. That night, I fought for every word. With Sarah's patient help, pointing to letters on an alphabet board she'd brought from the nurse's station, I spelled out my first command in this new, silent war. It took nearly an hour, my eyes burning with the effort of focusing, of blinking once for each correct letter. C, A, L, L, H, A, R, O, L, D. Sarah read the words, a slow, determined smile spreading across her face. "Consider it done," she said. My next message was shorter, but it held the entire weight of my intent, the key to my counterattack. A, C, T, I, V, A, T, E, L, E, G, A, C, Y, P, R, O, J, E, C, T. The game was on, and my children had no idea they were even playing. Harold, bless his loyal, methodical heart, arrived the next day under the guise of an old family friend paying his respects. He was a tall, stooped man in his 70s, with a mind as sharp as a tack and an unwavering moral compass that had guided our family's legal and financial affairs for over 40 years. He walked in, saw me in the bed, a network of tubes and wires tethering me to the world of the living, and his face, usually a mask of professional calm, crumpled with genuine sorrow. Sarah, ever the guardian, quietly explained the situation, her voice low and professional, giving him the briefest of summaries. "She's in here, Harold. She's fighting." Harold pulled a chair to my bedside, his movement slow and deliberate. He spoke to me about his prized rose garden, about his wife's recent hip replacement surgery. All the while, his keen lawyer's eyes searched mine for confirmation, for a sign of the woman he knew. I blinked once for yes, twice for no. It was our old system, from the days when I had sat on charity boards with him and we needed to communicate silently across a crowded room. It worked as well as ever. When he was sure we were on the same page, that the spark of Eleanor Sullivan was indeed still burning, he leaned in, his voice a low murmur. "The Legacy Project, Eleanor. Are you certain? It's formidable. It's a fortress." One blink. Yes. "It's also irrevocable once started," he cautioned, giving me one last chance to reconsider. "There's no going back." One blink. I know. A grim, determined smile touched his lips. "Richard would be proud. He always said you were the strategist, the chess player." He patted my hand, his touch firm and reassuring. "Don't you worry about a thing. I'll build them a wall of paper so high they won't know which way is up. You just focus on getting stronger. We'll need you for the endgame." And so it began. 2 days later, Michael, brimming with confidence I knew was a mask for his desperation, called Harold. His voice, as Harold later replayed for me on speakerphone during one of his visits, oozed a false professional courtesy that set my teeth on edge. "Harold, Michael Sullivan here," my son began, getting straight to the point. "Given my mother's unfortunate condition, we're moving to consolidate her assets to ensure her continued care is funded. I found an excellent buyer for the lake house, a fantastic all-cash offer, closing in 30 days. I just need you to process the title transfer." There was a pause. I could almost hear Harold taking a slow, deliberate sip of his morning coffee. "Well, Michael, it's not quite that simple," he said, his voice the epitome of calm, unassailable bureaucracy. "As you know, the property is held within the Sullivan Family Trust. Given Eleanor's incapacitation, any liquidation of a primary trust asset requires a full and thorough review by the trustees." "Trustees?" Michael sounded irritated, the mask of courtesy slipping. "You and my mother are the only trustees. She's unavailable."
Precisely, Harold said smoothly, the sound of pure, unadulterated legal procedure in his voice. "And since one trustee is incapacitated, my fiduciary duty requires me to conduct a thorough evaluation to ensure any sale is in her absolute best interest for the long term. I'll need to see a full financial workup, a certified market analysis from 3 independent firms, a formal proposal outlining the necessity of this specific sale versus other options." He went on, listing a dozen bureaucratic hurdles, each one more tedious and time-consuming than the last. "That's ridiculous. That could take months," Michael sputtered, his voice rising in frustration. "Indeed," Harold replied, and I could hear a note of quiet satisfaction in his voice. "It's a process. I'll send you the preliminary paperwork to get you started. Form 7B-4. You'll want to get started on that right away." He hung up. I lay in my bed and pictured Michael on the other end of the line, his face turning a satisfying shade of crimson. He, the high-flying financial advisor who prided himself on navigating complex systems, was being utterly and completely stonewalled by the very legal system he so often sought to manipulate. It was beautiful. The paper wall was the first line of defense. It was designed to do one thing: buy me time. Time to fight my way out of my physical prison. Each day became a battle fought on 2 fronts. In the silent world of my mind, I was a general, planning my next move with Harold. In the physical world, I was an infant, relearning the most basic of functions. I started with wiggling a toe. It took a full day of concentration, sweat beading on my brow, just to produce a flicker of movement. Then a finger. The frustration was immense, a white-hot rage that burned in my useless limbs. But the image of my children's faces, their greed and their deceit, was a powerful fuel. I would not let them win. I would learn to move, to speak, to walk again, if only to see the looks on their faces when I confronted them. The wall held for 2 weeks. Then Rebecca, ever the pragmatist, tried a different approach. She called Harold about the jewelry, her voice a carefully calibrated mix of sweetness and steel.
Harold, darling, she began, a tone she usually reserved for charming, difficult clients. I'm having Mom's jewelry appraised for insurance purposes, of course. Could you be a dear and let me know where she keeps the key to the safe deposit box at the bank? Ah, the jewelry, Harold said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. A beautiful collection. Also a trust item, I'm afraid, Rebecca. All personal property of significant value was folded into the trust years ago. It's all laid out in Schedule C of the trust agreement. I can send you the paperwork if you like. The silence on Rebecca's end was more telling than any angry outburst. She was a businesswoman. She knew she'd been outmaneuvered when a door had been politely but firmly slammed in her face. The paper wall had held again, but I knew this was just the beginning. They had tried to go through the wall. Now they would start looking for a way to tear it down. My granddaughter Olivia was my lifeline to the world outside my sterile white room, a beacon of uncomplicated love in a sea of betrayal. She was 16, caught in that awkward, beautiful phase between girl and woman, with my late husband's thoughtful eyes and a fierce loyalty that was a balm to my wounded soul. She visited every other day after school, her presence a stark contrast to the performative sorrow of her mother and the business-like brevity of her uncles. She didn't treat me like an invalid. She treated me like her grandmother. She'd read chapters from her history textbook aloud, complaining about the boring parts. She'd show me pictures of her dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Gus, on her phone. She'd tell me about the boy in her chemistry class she had a crush on. Her daily dramas, so small and yet so significant, were a reminder of a world that was still turning, a world I was determined to rejoin. It was during one of these visits that she unknowingly became my most valuable operative. "Grandma, I brought my tablet," she said one afternoon, her voice hushed as she pulled it from her backpack. "I know you can't talk, but I thought maybe you'd want to see the house, to know it's okay." It was an act of pure, youthful empathy, an attempt to bring me comfort in the only way she knew. She logged on to the security camera feed for my condo, a system Richard had insisted on installing years ago after a neighbor was burglarized. And there, on the small, bright screen, was my life, my living room, my armchair, the one Richard always sat in, its leather worn smooth over the years, my photos on the mantelpieces, the kids at various ages, our wedding portrait, a picture of Richard holding a ridiculously large fish he'd caught at the lake. But it wasn't okay. There were strangers in my house. A man and a woman with clipboards were walking through, pointing at furniture, their expressions detached and clinical. My son Thomas was with them, looking uncomfortable and avoiding the camera's gaze as they placed little colored stickers on my things. A green sticker on my favorite reading lamp, a yellow one on the Persian rug Richard and I had haggled for in the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul. They were inventorying my life for an estate sale. They were pricing my memories. A wave of nausea, hot and acidic, washed over me. This was a violation far more intimate than selling the lake house. These were the small, everyday objects that held the texture of my existence, the silent witnesses to my life with Richard. And they were being tagged for sale like secondhand goods. Olivia saw the single tear that escaped my eye and traced a hot path down my temple. Her own eyes, so like her grandfather's, filled with tears of righteous anger. "They promised they wouldn't," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fury she was too young to contain. Mom promised she would wait. She lied. That night, riddled with guilt and armed with a new, terrible understanding of the adults in her life, Olivia became my willing spy. It was her idea. She started leaving her phone on record in the kitchen when her mother and uncle came over to talk strategy. The snippets she played for me during her subsequent visits, her hand cupped around the phone's speaker, were horrifying. I heard Michael rage on one recording. The lawyer is blocking everything. It's like he anticipated this. This trust document is a fortress. We need to get control. We need power of attorney. How? Rebecca's voice was sharp, cutting. She's unresponsive. We'd have to declare her mentally incompetent. Do you have any idea what the legal fees for that kind of custody battle would be? It would be a nightmare. A public one. Custody. The word made my skin crawl. They were talking about me like I was a child to be managed, a problem to be solved. Then came the conversation that solidified my next move, the one that pushed me from a defensive posture into an offensive one.
"It's the condo, then," Michael said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The contents. The trust is vague on personal effects. Harold can't block us from selling the contents. We'll say it's to cover her medical bills. It's perfectly justifiable. We'll organize an estate sale, quickly, before the old man can figure out a way to file another injunction." Hearing this, a cold fire ignited in my chest. They were coming for the small things now, the heart of my home, the very fabric of my life with Richard. It was time for another shot across the bow, a reminder that I was still on the board. I took a slow, deliberate breath, and with a voice that was raspy but clear, I gave my next command. "Olivia," I said, savoring the feeling of the name on my tongue, the power of speech returning. "Tell Harold the game is over. It's time to set the final meeting." Michael thought he was the king on the chessboard, making a decisive, game-ending move. He didn't realize he was just a pawn, and he had just walked right into my carefully laid checkmate. He came to the hospital 2 days later, his lawyer in tow, a slick, overconfident man named Peterson, who looked like he billed by the syllable and wore a suit that cost more than my first car. Sarah, my ever-present guardian, allowed them in but stood by the door, her arms crossed, a silent, immovable statement of her allegiance. I was sitting up in a chair by the window, a position that had taken me 20 minutes of excruciating effort to achieve with Maria's help. The simple act of sitting upright felt like a monumental victory. It was worth it. I would not receive this news lying down. "Mother," Michael began, his voice dripping with a filial concern that was so false it was almost comical. "This is Mr. Peterson. We're here because we're very concerned about you, about your welfare." I just looked at him, my expression a carefully constructed mask of placid neutrality. I let the silence hang in the air, a weapon in itself, forcing them to fill it. Peterson cleared his throat and stepped forward, taking charge. "Mrs. Sullivan, given your current condition and the complexities of your estate, we feel it's in your best interest to have a legal guardian appointed by the court to manage your affairs. Michael has graciously volunteered for this responsibility. To protect you," Michael added smoothly, the words sliding off his tongue like oil, "from outside influences, from people who might not have your best interests at heart." He meant Harold, he meant James, he meant anyone who stood between him and my money. I held his gaze. I had spent weeks working with Maria, my physical therapist, and a speech therapist whose patience was saintly, to regain control. My voice was still rough, like gravel in a tin can, but it was mine. It was a weapon I had sharpened in secret. "And what if I refuse?" I asked. The surprise on their faces was a small, satisfying victory, a crack in their smug facade. Michael's jaw went slack.
Peterson's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. They had come expecting to deliver a monologue to a silent invalid. They were not prepared for a dialogue. "Mother," Michael recovered, his tone shifting to one of condescending pity. "You don't understand the complexities, the legal ramifications." "I understand," I cut him off, my voice gaining a little strength, a little of its old authority, "that you are trying to take everything." Peterson stepped in again, his professional mask back in place. "Mrs. Sullivan, with all due respect, this isn't a negotiation. We will be filing the petition with the court tomorrow morning. A judge will review the medical evidence. It's a fairly straightforward process in cases like these." He thought he was delivering the final blow. He thought he was informing a helpless old woman that her life was no longer her own. He was wrong. I took a slow breath, letting them savor their perceived victory for a moment longer. Then, I looked past them, to Sarah, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I turned my gaze back to my son, the son who thought he had me beaten. "Then," I said, my voice clear and cold as a winter morning, "I suppose you should save your filing fee." Michael frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking," I said, slowly and deliberately, each word a carefully placed stone, "about the fact that I have just been medically cleared by my doctors. I am of sound mind and body, and I will be discharging myself from this hospital tomorrow." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the beeping of the machines seemed to have stopped, holding its breath. Michael's face went through a rapid, comical series of transformations, from smug to confused to utterly, completely horrified in the space of 3 seconds. He looked at Sarah, who simply raised an eyebrow in confirmation. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in weeks, and saw not a frail victim, not a collection of symptoms on a chart, but his mother in full and terrifying command of her faculties. "So," I continued, enjoying the moment of his complete unraveling, the collapse of his carefully constructed plan, "instead of meeting in court, we will meet at the Late House, Saturday, noon. You, Rebecca, Thomas, my lawyer, will be there. We are going to settle everything." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He was a financial advisor, a man who dealt in numbers and certainties, in profits and losses. I had presented him with an equation he could not solve, a variable he had never considered. He had come to checkmate a pawn, only to find the queen was waiting for him, and she was about to sweep the board clean. "I'll see you on Saturday, Michael," I said, dismissing him with a wave of a hand that just a week ago I couldn't even lift. He and his lawyer practically stumbled out of the room, their retreat a chaotic mess of dropped briefcases and muttered curses. When they were gone, Sarah let out a long, low whistle. "Eleanor," she said, a grin spreading across her face, "that was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes, the first in a long time. The silent chess game was over. Now it was time to flip the board. The drive to the lake house was a pilgrimage, a journey back to myself. Every familiar turn in the road, every canopy of autumn leaves bursting into flame-colored glory, felt like a piece of my stolen life being returned to me. Harold drove, his steady presence a comfort, and I sat in the passenger seat, no longer a patient in a gown, but a woman in a tailored blazer on a mission. The house looked the same as it always had, a comforting presence of cedar and stone nestled among the pines, its wide porch overlooking the shimmering, diamond-bright water. But the air was different.
It was thick with tension, charged like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. They were already there. My children. They stood clustered on the porch, a united front of simmering resentment and confusion. Michael was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear, no doubt getting last-minute advice from his flustered lawyer. Rebecca stood with her arms crossed, a designer handbag slung over her shoulder like a shield, her face a mask of cold fury. Thomas, my poor, lost Thomas, just looked pale and sick, a man caught in a tide too strong for him to swim against. And Olivia, my brave Olivia, stood apart from them, near the oak tree Richard had planted as a sapling, her expression a mixture of anxiety and fierce, unfailing hope.
When I stepped out of the car, with Harold's steadying arm, a hush fell over them. It was the first time they had seen me on my own 2 feet since the stroke. I was thinner, yes, and I walked with the assistance of an elegant silver-handled cane, but I was not the broken woman from the hospital bed. I was the matriarch of this family, the foundation of this house, and I had come home to reclaim my throne. We convened in the great room, the heart of the house. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, the same fireplace Richard and I had designed together on a napkin one evening. I took my place in his old leather armchair at the head of the room, the position of power. Harold sat beside me, a thick leather briefcase on his lap, his expression grim and professional. My children sat opposite us on the long sofa, a tribunal of the guilty. Their lawyer, Peterson, perched uncomfortably on the edge of a side chair. And there was one other person present, a detail I had arranged with Harold. A young man stood quietly by the window, looking out at the lake, his back to the room. He was tall and lean, with a kind, serious face, and eyes that held a familiar intelligence. "Who the hell is he?" Michael demanded, dispensing with any pretense of civility, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "This is a family matter." "This," I said, my voice resonating with a strength that surprised even me, "this is Dr. James Mitchell." James turned from the window and gave a slight, polite nod to the room. The name hung in the air, charged with meaning, an unspoken accusation. Michael's lawyer, the slick Mr. Peterson, cleared his throat, attempting to seize control of the proceedings. "Let's dispense with the theatrics, shall we? My client is here to discuss the guardianship petition, which we are now withdrawing, of course, but also the immediate liquidation of this property to cover his mother's extensive medical—" "There will be no guardianship," Harold cut in, his voice like cold steel, slicing through Peterson's bluster. "And you are not selling this house. Not today, not ever, because your clients have no legal claim to it." He opened his briefcase with a decisive snap and laid a single, thick document on the coffee table between us. The deed to the house. "As you can see," Harold said, his finger tapping on the signature line, "this property was legally and irrevocably transferred 8 years ago to one Mr. James Mitchell." The explosion was immediate and predictable. "That's impossible!" Rebecca cried, jumping to her feet. "This is our family home. This is our inheritance. We grew up here." "She was manipulated," Michael shouted, his face contorting with rage, pointing a trembling finger first at James, then at me. You did, Harold. We'll have this overturned in court so fast your head'll spin. This is fraud." I let them rage. I let the poison spill out, filling the beautiful room that had only ever known love and laughter with their ugly, selfish venom. I looked at their faces, distorted by greed and fury, and my heart ached. Not for me, for them, for the people they had become. When their shouting finally subsided into ragged breaths, when their accusations hung in the air like smoke, I finally spoke. "You talk
about this house as your inheritance. I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute authority, cutting through the tense silence. You have no idea what an inheritance is. I looked at Michael, my son, the man who wanted to declare me incompetent. You say I was manipulated? Let me tell you about manipulation, Michael. Is it manipulating someone to ask your father for $100,000 for a sure-thing investment that you knew was a high-risk gamble to bail you out of a debt you were too proud to admit you had? Michael's face went white. The color drained from it as if a plug had been pulled. He knew I knew. I turned to Rebecca, my daughter, my beautiful, ambitious girl. And you, my daughter, you speak of what's yours. You speak of this house as your right. Did you ever once acknowledge the letters I sent with the checks to save your business? The ones where I told you I was proud of your courage, not your profit margins? The ones where I told you that your worth wasn't tied to your company's bottom line? Or were they just paper you discarded on the way to the bank? Rebecca stared at her hands, her carefully constructed composure cracking like fine porcelain. You stand here in this house, I continued, my voice rising with a righteous passion I hadn't felt in years, and you desecrate it with your talk of money and ownership. This house was never about money. It was built on a promise. It was paid for with love and loyalty, things you clearly know nothing about. I paused, letting the words sink in, letting them feel the full weight of their shame. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, a lonely, judgmental witness. You want to talk about sound mind? I said, locking eyes with Michael, pinning him with my gaze. You want to put my competency on trial? Fine. Let's have a trial. Right here, right now. And the first witness will be your father. I gave Harold a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He reached into his briefcase and produced a small remote control. With a click, a projector screen I had Harold install weeks ago, under the guise of upgrading the home entertainment system, descended silently from a hidden recess in the ceiling beams. Another click, and the screen flickered to life. And there he was, my Richard. He was not the frail man from the end of his life, but Richard in his prime, sitting in this very room, in this very leather armchair I now occupied. He looked healthy, vibrant, his eyes clear and direct, his favorite worn cardigan draped over his shoulders. A collective gasp came from the sofa. It was as if a ghost had walked into the room, a ghost with a message. Hello, Michael, Rebecca, Thomas. If you're watching this, it means your mother has decided it's time. It means you've forced her hand. And for that, I am deeply, deeply sorry. He leaned forward, his expression on the screen a mixture of love and profound, heart-wrenching disappointment. Your mother and I built this life on a few simple principles. Work hard, be honest, and above all, be kind. Kindness isn't a weakness. It's a currency. The most valuable when there is. And somewhere along the line, you three lost sight of that. You started seeing kindness as something to be exploited, and family as a safety net you could cut apart and sell for scraps. Then he told the story of Catherine, my best friend, and his voice softened with affection and memory. He spoke of her unwavering support for our family during my difficult pregnancy with Thomas, of the meals she brought, of the nights she sat with me. He spoke of the promise we made to her when she was dying, a promise to look after her only son.
So yes, Richard said, looking directly into the camera, his gaze piercing and direct. We gave this house to her son, James. We set him up for life, not because he was our blood, but because it was the right thing to do. It was an investment in a debt of kindness that could never truly be repaid. This house belongs to James. That is not negotiable. End of discussion. Michael started to protest, a strangled noise escaping his throat, but Richard's voice from the screen cut him off as if he were in the room. "But what about you?" Richard continued, his gaze hardening, his voice taking on the firm, no-nonsense tone he used when they were children and had truly crossed a line. "Your inheritance. You think it's your right. You think you've earned it. Let me tell you what you've earned." This was it. The final hidden clause, the heart of the legacy project, the checkmate. "Your inheritance is real. It's substantial," Richard said, and despite the circumstances, I saw a flicker of avarice, of renewed hope light up my children's faces. "But it is locked by what your mother and I call the legacy clause. It is not accessible to you, not one single dime, until you prove you understand the principles upon which it was built." He laid out the terms, clear and concise as a legal contract, leaving no room for misinterpretation. 1. You will each complete 200 hours of documented community service. And I don't mean writing a check to a fancy charity for a tax deduction. I'm talking about serving food in a shelter, reading to the blind, cleaning up a public park. You will get your hands dirty. You will see how the other half lives. 2. You will each undergo a full, independent financial audit and mandatory financial counseling to get your own houses in order, without a single penny from the trust. Harold will be the sole arbitrator. He will review your progress. He and only he will decide when you have met the terms. He leaned back in his chair, his voice a low, powerful final statement that was both a condemnation and a plea. "Your mother and I gave you everything. We gave you a good home, a fine education, a safety net for every fall. We gave you everything except the one thing you have to earn for yourselves: character. This is your chance to earn it. The choice is yours. The money will wait." The screen went black. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of 3 lines being irrevocably altered, of 3 selfish worlds crashing to a halt. It was the sound of arrogance being shattered into a million pieces. It was the sound of a father's love, tough and absolute, reaching out from beyond the grave to save his children from themselves. Michael sat stunned, his face ashen, the reality of his financial ruin finally, truly crashing down on him. Rebecca was openly weeping, silent tears streaming down her face, not for the money, but for the shame, for the stark, ugly revelation of her own character. And Thomas, my gentle, lost Thomas, simply looked at me, his eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding and the first glimmers of remorse. The reckoning was complete. The aftermath was not a sudden, cinematic healing. There was no group hug, no immediate apologies. The wounds were too deep, the betrayals too raw. It was a slow, messy, and painful untangling of years of resentment, entitlement, and misunderstanding. Michael, true to form, stormed out of the house that day, his face a mask of fury. He shouted threats of lawsuits, of contesting the will, of accusing Harold of undue influence. But they were empty words, the last gasps of a dying ego. The video was Richard's will, his final testament, and it was ironclad. Harold made sure of that. Thomas was the first to break. A week later, he called me. He didn't say hello, he just started talking, his voice small and broken, like a child's. "I'm sorry, Mom," he wept, the words tumbling out between sobs. I followed them. I always followed them. I don't know what to do." "You know exactly what to do," I told him gently, my own voice thick with emotion. "Your father told you." The following Saturday, he sent me a picture from his phone. It was him, wearing a bright orange vest and thick work gloves, picking up trash along a highway median with a group of volunteers. He looked tired and out of place, but he was there. It was a start.
He began volunteering at a local food bank, and in his weekly calls he started talking not about himself, but about the people he met there, a single mother working 2 jobs, an elderly man who had lost his pension. For the first time, my son was seeing the world outside his own small bubble of self-interest. Rebecca's journey was more complicated. She was proud and fiercely private. She disappeared for 3 weeks. No calls, no texts. Olivia was beside herself for worry, calling me every day. I told her to be patient, that her mother needed to find her own way back. Then, one day, Rebecca showed up at my condo, unannounced. She looked tired, stripped of her usual corporate armor of tailored suits and perfect makeup. She'd sold her struggling company, paid off her debts with the proceeds, and moved into a small, rented apartment. She said I'd like to help with the Harvest Festival at the vineyard. I have no experience, but I'm a good worker, she said. How hard can it be picking grapes? I told her I would ask Foltz with my final laugh. Sure, she said. Then she said, I've been thinking about those letters you sent, the ones that came with the checks, the ones I never answered. She finally looked at me, her own eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than any financial loss. I think I'd like to read them again, if you still have them. Of course I do, I said softly. I had saved every one. She began volunteering at the very hospital where I had been a patient, working in the children's ward, reading stories to sick kids. She found a purpose there, a sense of fulfillment that her endless pursuit of promotion and profit had never given her. Our conversations became more frequent, hesitant at first, but slowly, brick by brick, we began to rebuild the bridge between us. She was rediscovering not her inheritance, but herself. Michael was the last holdout. His pride was a fortress. He was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. The humiliation was a public spectacle, a bitter pill for a man so defined by his image of success. He lost his big house, his fancy car, his place in the social pecking order. He lost everything he thought mattered. For 6 long, silent months, we heard nothing from him. I began to fear he was lost to us forever, a casualty of his own arrogance. Then a letter arrived. It wasn't from a lawyer. The handwriting on the envelope was his, a scrawl I hadn't seen since he was in college. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of cheap-lined paper.
Mom, it began, I'm in Cleveland. I have a job, a real job, a salaried position at a small accounting firm. It's not glamorous. I live in a small apartment I can barely afford. My wife, Karen, is pregnant. It's a girl. For the first time in my life, I feel the weight of every dollar I spend. For the first time, I am scared. And for the first time, I feel like I am standing on my own 2 feet without the safety net. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. We're going to name her Catherine. I folded the letter, a single tear splashing onto the cheap paper. My son had finally understood. The lesson, in all its brutality and grace, had been learned. He had found his way home, not by coming back, but by starting over. A year has passed since that day at the lake house, the day of the reckoning. I'm sitting on the porch, a warm mug of tea in my hands, watching the late afternoon sun dance on the water. The house is quiet, filled with a peaceful, settled energy it hasn't known in years. James got his grant. His research is showing incredible promise. He calls me every Sunday, and his excitement is infectious. He comes to visit often, not out of obligation, but as family. He and Olivia have formed an unlikely, wonderful friendship. 2 bright, good-hearted souls connected by a legacy of kindness they both embody. The Catherine Mitchell Foundation, which I established with the funds from the trust, has awarded its first round of scholarships to promising, underprivileged medical students. Rebecca and Thomas are now on the board of directors. Their insights, born from their own hard-won humility, are invaluable. They vet the candidates with a wisdom that money cannot buy. I look out at the lake, its surface calm and deep, reflecting the endless blue sky, and I think about the nature of an inheritance. My children thought it was this house, this land, the money in the bank. They thought it was something to be claimed, divided, and spent. They were wrong. My true inheritance came from my parents, a strong back and a belief in the power of a day's hard work. The inheritance I received from my beloved Richard was a lifetime of unconditional love and a partnership built on unwavering trust. The inheritance I have tried to give my children is far more difficult to accept, but infinitely more valuable: a second chance. A chance to rebuild their lives not on a foundation of entitlement, but on the bedrock of character. The storm has cast, the wreckage has been cleared, and in its place, something new and stronger has begun to grow. I didn't just save a house, I may have, in the end, saved my family, and that is a legacy worth any price.